a very different situation for all of us. And, Archie was so little.
At 7:18 a.m. on December 3rd, a clip from Sarah Ferguson's interview with a Portuguese journalist began circulating online, and within minutes it detonated across every major platform. The segment was brief, barely 90 seconds, but the words Sarah spoke carried a weight that stopped viewers mid-scroll. She had been discussing her exile, her isolation, her loss of royal support, when suddenly her expression shifted, hardened, and she said something no one expected. Meghan understood the game better than anyone. She knew exactly what she was doing from the beginning. The statement hung in the air like smoke, and before the morning ended, Meghan Markle would be photographed leaving her Montecito home. Visibly shaken, her eyes red, her composure shattered in a way the public had never seen before. The revelation. The interview had been arranged quietly, almost casually. Sarah Ferguson, now living in semi-permanent exile in Portugal after being severed from royal provisions in late November, had agreed to speak with a respected European correspondent known for sympathetic profiles of displaced public figures. The conversation was supposed to be reflective, gentle, an opportunity for Sarah to present herself as a woman rebuilding after years of turbulence. And for most of the 30-minute segment, that's exactly what it was. Sarah spoke about her daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, with obvious pride and affection. She discussed her charitable work, her writing projects, and her determination to find peace away from the relentless scrutiny of British tabloids. She even touched on her relationship with Prince Andrew, describing it with the measured language of someone who had learned painfully when to speak and when to stay silent. The journalist, sensing Sarah's guardedness, asked gentle questions, offering sympathy where appropriate, steering clear of anything too inflammatory. But then, near the end of the interview, the conversation shifted. The journalist asked Sarah about the broader changes within the royal family, the exits, the exiles, the tightening circle around King Charles. And Sarah, perhaps exhausted, perhaps emboldened by distance, perhaps simply unable to hold back any longer, began speaking with a directness that caught even the journalist off guard. She started by acknowledging her own mistakes, the financial chaos, the infamous Epstein email, the decades of public missteps, but then her tone changed, sharpening. "I was cast out," she said, "for things I did in desperation, but others who calculated their exits, who manipulated narratives, who played the victim while wielding power, they were celebrated." The journalist leaned forward, sensing the shift. "Who are you referring to?" Sarah paused, just long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. Then she said it. Meghan understood the game better than anyone. She knew exactly what she was doing from the beginning. She wasn't naive about media or royal life. She was strategic. And the difference between us is that when I made mistakes, I owned them eventually. When she made calculations, she called them survival. The clip was uploaded to social media by a Portuguese news outlet at 6:52 a.m. GMT. Within 15 minutes, it had been reposted, translated, and dissected across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. By 7:15, British tabloids had picked it up. By 7:20, American morning shows were interrupting their scheduled programming. And by 7:30, sources close to Meghan confirmed that she had seen the clip and was, in the words of one insider, utterly devastated. What made Sarah's statement so explosive wasn't just the accusation itself. It was the specificity, the implication that Sarah possessed knowledge, insider knowledge, about Meghan's intentions and strategies during her time as a working royal. For years, Sarah had remained notably silent on the Sussex saga, offering only vague platitudes about the difficulties of marrying into the royal family. But this was different. This was a direct public allegation that Meghan had been calculating, manipulative, strategic in ways the public didn't fully understand. Inside Buckingham Palace, the reaction was immediate alarm. Senior advisors convened an emergency call before 8 a.m., reviewing the clip, assessing the legal and reputational implications, and trying to determine what, if anything, Sarah might reveal next. Princess Anne, briefed during her morning schedule, reportedly said only one thing: "I warned everyone she would become a liability." William, reviewing the footage at Kensington Palace, felt a complicated mixture of concern and frustration. He had never trusted Sarah's discretion, but he also understood that her desperation, her exile, her financial instability made her unpredictable in ways the palace could no longer control. Camilla, who had spent years navigating her own reputational rehabilitation, recognized the danger immediately. Sarah's statement wasn't just an attack on Meghan. It was a crack in the carefully maintained silence that had protected the family from further Sussex-related chaos. But the most significant reaction came from California. According to multiple sources close to the Sussex household, Meghan saw the clip shortly after 7 a.m. Pacific time. She had been preparing for a morning meeting related to her production company when an assistant monitoring news alerts brought the video to her attention. Meghan watched it once, then again, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something those present described as raw, unguarded pain. Harry, who was in another room, heard the sudden silence and came to find her. When he saw the clip, his reaction was immediate and protective. He began making calls, reaching out to their legal team, their publicists, anyone who could help them understand the full scope of what Sarah had said and what it might mean. But Meghan, according to those closest to her, had already begun to unravel. The composure she had maintained through years of attacks, the resilience she had shown through relentless criticism, seemed to fracture under the weight of this particular betrayal, because that's what it was. A betrayal. Sarah Ferguson, a woman who had experienced her own exile, her own public humiliation, her own struggle against a system that demanded perfection while offering little protection, had turned on Meghan in the most public way imaginable. And the timing, coming just days after Sarah's own forced separation from royal provisions, suggested something even darker. That Sarah, desperate and isolated, had chosen to weaponize whatever knowledge she possessed about Meghan as a form of retaliation, relevance, or survival. By mid-morning, photographs emerged of Meghan leaving her Montecito home, dressed in dark sunglasses and a heavy coat despite the California sunshine. Those who saw the images noted her body language, the way she moved quickly to the car, the visible tension in her shoulders, the absence of her usual composed smile. It was a rare, unguarded moment, one that told the world more than any statement could. Meghan Markle, a woman who had built her public identity on strength and resilience, was breaking. The background. Years of hidden tension. To understand why Sarah Ferguson's revelation carried such devastating weight, we need to step back into the complicated, often hidden relationship between two women who on the surface seemed to share so much. Both married into the royal family as outsiders. Both faced relentless tabloid scrutiny. Both navigated the impossible expectations of an institution built on tradition and resistant to change. And both ultimately found themselves cast out, exiled from the very world they had once tried so hard to belong to. Sarah Ferguson entered the royal family in 1986, marrying Prince Andrew in a ceremony that captured the public's imagination. She was vibrant, outspoken, refreshingly unpolished, compared to the controlled elegance of Princess Diana. The press loved her initially, dubbing her the Duchess of Fun, celebrating her energy and relatability. But that affection soured quickly. Within years, Sarah became tabloid fodder, criticized for her weight, her spending, her perceived lack of decorum. By 1992, her marriage to Andrew had collapsed under the strain of scandal, separation, and a media culture that thrived on tearing down the very figures it had once elevated. When Meghan Markle married Prince Harry in 2018, the parallels were impossible to ignore. Another outsider, another woman bringing a different energy to the monarchy, another target for a tabloid machine that had grown only more vicious in the digital age. Sarah, by then rehabilitated to some degree through years of charity work and public resilience, watched Meghan's entrance with what those close to her described as a mixture of sympathy and wariness. In the early months, there were quiet connections. Sarah reportedly reached out to Meghan through mutual contacts, offering advice, sharing her own experiences, and warning her about the pitfalls that lay ahead. Meghan, according to sources, was grateful but cautious. She believed her situation was different, that her media training, her independence, and Harry's protection would shield her from the worst of what Sarah had endured. Sarah, those close to her recall, found that confidence both admirable and naive. But as Meghan's time as a working royal progressed, cracks began forming in whatever solidarity had existed between them. Sarah watched as Meghan navigated the family with a polish and strategic precision Sarah herself had never possessed. Meghan's public engagements were flawless. Her speeches were carefully crafted. Her image, while controversial in some circles, was meticulously managed in ways that suggested a level of control Sarah had never achieved during her own chaotic years. And then came the Sussex departure in 2020. Sarah, still living at Royal Lodge with Andrew, watched the fallout with complicated emotions. On one hand, she understood the impulse to leave, to escape the suffocating constraints of royal life. On the other hand, she couldn't help but notice the differences. Meghan and Harry left on their own terms with a global platform, lucrative deals with Netflix and Spotify, and a narrative of victimhood that resonated powerfully, especially in the United States. Sarah, by contrast, had been pushed out, humiliated, left financially unstable, and denied the kind of sympathetic reinvention Meghan seemed to achieve almost effortlessly. Those differences festered quietly over the years. Sarah never spoke publicly about Meghan, maintaining a careful neutrality that palace watchers assumed was strategic. But privately, according to those who knew her, Sarah harbored resentment, not necessarily toward Meghan as a person, but toward the disparity in their outcomes. Both women had been deemed problematic by the institution. Both had been pushed to the margins, but only one had emerged with global influence, financial security, and a narrative that positioned her as a courageous truth-teller rather than a cautionary tale. By late 2025, as Sarah faced her own final exile, losing royal provisions and being effectively erased from the monarchy's future, that resentment deepened into something sharper. Sarah saw Meghan living in Montecito, building a media empire, maintaining her platform, while Sarah herself was being quietly shipped off to Portugal with barely enough support to maintain dignity. The injustice of it, at least from Sarah's perspective, became unbearable. There was also the matter of what Sarah believed she knew. During Meghan's brief time as a working royal, Sarah had still been somewhat connected to family functions, still invited to occasional gatherings, still privy to conversations that happened on the margins of official events. And in those moments, Sarah had observed things. The way Meghan managed situations, the careful calibration of her public responses, the strategic deployment of emotional appeals. Nothing illegal, nothing even particularly wrong, but enough to convince Sarah that Meghan's claims of naivety were performances rather than truth. Sarah had watched Meghan navigate media storms with a sophistication that contradicted her public statements about being unprepared for royal attention. She'd noticed how certain stories seemed to emerge at strategically opportune moments, how Meghan's side of various conflicts always seemed to reach sympathetic journalists with remarkable speed. And she'd heard things, fragments of conversations, observations from staff, comments from family members, that painted a picture of someone far more calculating than the innocent victim narrative suggested. For years, Sarah had kept these observations to herself, partly out of discretion, partly out of fear of palace retribution, partly because speaking out would have made her look petty and vindictive. But as her own exile became permanent, as the palace cut her off without ceremony or sympathy, as she sat alone in her Portuguese villa watching Meghan continue to thrive while she struggled, Sarah's commitment to silence began to erode. The final straw came when Sarah learned, through sources she still maintained within royal circles, that Meghan had given another interview discussing the challenges of royal life, positioning herself once again as someone who'd been victimized by an inflexible institution. Sarah, drinking wine on her terrace and watching the Atlantic turn silver under a November moon, felt something inside her snap. She'd been cast out for mistakes made in desperation. Meghan had left by choice, with support and resources Sarah had never enjoyed. And yet Meghan was still claiming victim status while Sarah was expected to disappear quietly into exile. That sense of injustice, combined with isolation and the particular kind of recklessness that comes from having nothing left to lose, set the stage for what would happen on December 3rd. When the Portuguese journalist asked about royal exits, Sarah saw an opportunity not just to speak her truth, but to correct what she viewed as a fundamental distortion in the public narrative. And she took it. Consequences be damned. The pressure that built to breaking. The weeks leading up to Sarah's explosive revelation had been marked by a series of pressures that, viewed individually, seemed manageable. Viewed collectively, they painted a picture of a woman being pushed beyond her capacity to maintain the careful silence she'd preserved for years. Sarah's exile in Portugal, framed initially as a fresh start, had quickly revealed itself to be something closer to abandonment. The villa she'd been set up in was comfortable enough, certainly more pleasant than many people enjoyed, but it was also profoundly isolating. She knew no one in the area, her Portuguese was limited to pleasantries, and the distance from England, from her daughters, from the only world she'd ever really known, created a kind of emotional vacuum that wine and ocean views couldn't fill. Financial pressures compounded the isolation. The palace had severed her provisions entirely, leaving Sarah to survive on modest income from book sales and whatever charitable work she could still secure. But many of her previous partnerships had evaporated in the wake of her renewed association with Andrew's scandals. Organizations that had once been happy to have the Duchess of York's name attached suddenly developed concerns about reputational risk. Without royal connection and with mounting negative publicity, Sarah found herself in the familiar but terrifying position of not knowing how she'd maintain even basic stability. Beatrice and Eugenie were caught in an impossible position, loving their mother but also understanding why the palace had felt forced to act. They tried to help financially where they could, discreetly, but both had their own families and their own complicated relationships with the institution. Every time they sent support to Sarah, they risked drawing palace scrutiny themselves. And every time they didn't, they felt the weight of abandoning their mother to face exile alone. During a video call in mid-November, Eugenie had tried gently to counsel her mother toward acceptance. "Mom, I know this isn't what you wanted. I know it feels unfair. But speaking out, saying anything publicly, it'll only make things worse. You know how the palace responds to criticism." Sarah had nodded, agreeing in the moment, but Eugenie could see something hardening behind her mother's eyes. A resolve that suggested acceptance wasn't coming no matter how strategically wise it might be. Inside Buckingham Palace, awareness was growing that Sarah was becoming unpredictable. William received reports from security services that monitored potential threats to royal reputation. Sarah had been making inquiries with journalists, reaching out to media contacts, behavior that suggested she might be considering speaking publicly. William had discussed the concern with Anne during a November meeting, and Anne's response had been characteristically blunt. "We pushed her too far, too fast, without adequate support. Now we'll pay the price for that miscalculation." King Charles, when informed of Sarah's apparent media outreach, had felt a wave of exhaustion. Another crisis, another family member on the verge of creating complications he didn't have energy to manage. He'd authorized quiet contacts with Sarah through intermediaries, messages essentially offering small financial assistance in exchange for continued discretion. But Sarah, proud and angry, had rejected these overtures. She didn't want to be bought off. She wanted acknowledgement that she'd been treated unjustly. Camilla had perhaps the clearest view of where things were heading. She'd lived through her own period of being cast as royal villain, understood intimately how isolation and public contempt could warp judgment. During a private conversation with Charles in late November, she'd warned him directly, "Sarah is going to speak, not because she's cruel, but because she's desperate. And when desperate people speak, they say things they can't take back." Charles had asked what Camilla suggested they do. Her answer was unsettling in its honesty. "Nothing. We created this situation. Now we endure its consequences." The pressure on Sarah intensified when she learned through contacts she still maintained that the palace was preparing to formalize her separation from any remaining ceremonial connections. Documents were being drafted that would explicitly state she had no official role, no standing, no claim to represent the royal family in any capacity. To Sarah, this felt like being erased from history, written out of a story she'd lived for 40 years. The anger that produced was visceral, overwhelming. There was also the matter of Meghan's continued prominence. Throughout November, as Sarah struggled in Portuguese isolation, Meghan had been visible, active, building her brand with apparent ease. An appearance here, a project announcement there, interviews discussing her evolution and growth. To Sarah, watching from exile, it seemed profoundly unjust. Meghan had chosen to leave, had walked away with support and resources. Sarah had been forced out with nothing, and yet Meghan was thriving while Sarah was expected to disappear quietly. The breaking point came in late November, when Sarah saw coverage of Meghan discussing the challenges of being misunderstood by institutions resistant to change. The interview was carefully done, Meghan sympathetic but not vindictive, positioning herself as someone who'd tried to make things work but ultimately had to prioritize her own well-being. Sarah, watching alone in her villa, felt something inside her crystallize into cold fury. She'd been silent for years about what she'd observed during Meghan's time in the royal family, silent about the calculated nature of certain media interventions, silent about the ways Meghan had manipulated situations to her advantage while claiming victimhood, silent because speaking would have made Sarah look petty, jealous, vindictive, But watching Meghan continue to profit from a victim narrative while Sarah suffered actual exile created a kind of moral urgency in Sarah's mind. Someone needed to correct the record. Someone needed to say what palace insiders knew, but couldn't publicly acknowledge. When the Portuguese journalist reached out requesting an interview, Sarah saw it not as opportunity for revenge, but as obligation to truth. She convinced herself she wasn't attacking Meghan, she was providing context the public deserved. She told herself she was being honest, not cruel, and she scheduled the interview, prepared her thoughts, and made the decision that would change everything. She would speak. She would tell what she knew, and whatever consequences followed, she would face them as someone who'd finally refused to protect people who'd never protected her. The breaking point. What Sarah actually said. When the full interview aired later on December 3rd, the context surrounding Sarah's explosive statement about Meghan became clearer and somehow even more devastating. Because what Sarah revealed wasn't a single accusation. It was a pattern of observations, implications, and thinly veiled suggestions that painted Meghan not as a victim of the institution, but as a calculating participant who had understood the game from the very beginning. The journalist, sensing Sarah's willingness to speak freely, had asked a direct question. "Do you believe Meghan Markle was treated unfairly by the royal family?" Sarah's response was measured at first, almost diplomatic. "Every woman who marries into that world faces challenges," she said. "The system is unforgiving." But then came the turn. "However," she continued, "there is a difference between someone who stumbles through those challenges and someone who navigates them with precision." The journalist pressed. "What do you mean by precision?" Sarah leaned back, her expression unreadable. Meghan came from a world of media, of image management, of strategic storytelling. She understood optics in ways most royal brides never could, and she used that understanding brilliantly. The journalist asked if Sarah was suggesting Meghan manipulated her situation. Sarah's answer was careful but unmistakable. "I'm suggesting she knew exactly how to position herself as the wrong party, even when circumstances were more complicated than her narrative allowed. I watched her during family gatherings, during the brief time I was still invited to things. The way she'd respond to situations, the timing of certain revelations, the strategic deployment of emotional appeals. It was sophisticated, professional even. But the most damaging moment came when Sarah referenced specific incidents. She mentioned Meghan's early engagements, noting how perfectly they were calibrated for maximum sympathetic coverage. She alluded to private family conversations that had somehow found their way into public narratives, suggesting that information was being selectively leaked to shape perception. And then, in the moment that would dominate every headline, Sarah said this: "There were those of us who made mistakes out of desperation, out of naivety. I certainly did. My financial chaos, my poor judgment, all of it was real failure. And then there were those who made choices out of strategy. Meghan was never naive. She was strategic. Every move calculated, every statement crafted, and the family knew it, even if they couldn't say it publicly. The difference is that when I failed, I owned it eventually. When she calculated, she called it survival. The clip went viral within minutes of being isolated and shared. But what truly devastated Meghan wasn't just the accusation of calculation. It was the implication that Sarah possessed insider knowledge, that she had been present for conversations, decisions, or observations that contradicted the narrative Meghan and Harry had spent years constructing. Because if Sarah, a peripheral figure, knew things that undermined Meghan's story, what else might other family members know? And more terrifyingly, what might they say if they ever chose to speak? In Montecito, Meghan's reaction intensified as the full interview spread across media platforms. According to sources close to the household, she watched the entire segment, pausing repeatedly to process what Sarah was saying. Harry sat beside her, his jaw tight, his frustration building. But while Harry's anger was directed outward, at Sarah, at the palace, at the system that had hurt them both, Meghan's response was more internalized, more personal. She reportedly said very little after watching, retreating to a private room where she remained for hours. Friends who spoke to her later described her as emotionally shattered. Not because Sarah's accusations were true, they insisted, but because the attack had come from someone Meghan once viewed as a potential ally. Sarah, more than almost anyone, should have understood what it meant to be vilified, isolated, and pushed out. Instead, she had chosen to join the chorus of criticism, and she had done so in a way that felt deeply personally cruel. Harry's response was swift and protective. Within hours, his legal team issued a statement calling Sarah's comments reckless and defamatory, warning that legal action would be considered if she continued making unfounded allegations. But the statement felt reactive, defensive, lacking the controlled authority that usually characterized Sussex communications. And that, more than anything, revealed how deeply Sarah's revelation had rattled them. Inside Buckingham Palace, the fallout was equally chaotic. William, reviewing the interview with his senior team, felt a grim vindication. He had always believed Meghan's departure was strategic, calculated, and Sarah's comments, however inappropriate, seemed to confirm suspicions he had held for years. But he also understood the danger. Sarah's willingness to speak openly meant the door was now open for other marginal figures, other exiled family members, to share their own versions of events. The palace's strategy of silence, already fragile, was now under existential threat. Anne's reaction was characteristically blunt. She told Charles directly that Sarah had crossed a line from which there was no return. The family could no longer offer her any form of support, financial or otherwise. She had chosen her path, and she would have to live with the consequences. Camilla, more empathetic given her own history, felt a complicated mixture of understanding and disappointment. She knew what drove Sarah to speak: the desperation, the isolation, the need to be heard, but she also knew that Sarah's choice would harm both women, herself and Meghan, in ways that might never be repaired. The aftermath and fallout. The hours following Sarah's revelation unfolded with a speed and intensity that caught even seasoned royal watchers by surprise. What began as a 90-second clip from a Portuguese interview became a global conversation about truth, narrative, and the complicated dynamics of two women whose lives had intersected in the shadow of the British monarchy. By mid-afternoon on December 3rd, every major network had covered the story. British outlets framed it as a royal feud reigniting, with some commentators expressing sympathy for Sarah's frustration, while others condemned her timing and tone. American coverage was sharper, more defensive of Meghan, with panels debating whether Sarah's comments constituted jealousy, desperation, or legitimate critique. The divide was stark, reflecting the broader transatlantic split in how Meghan and Harry's story had been received. Inside the Sussex household, the response strategy evolved throughout the day. Initial legal threats gave way to more carefully crafted messaging. By evening, a statement was released through Meghan and Harry's Archewell Foundation, not addressing Sarah directly, but emphasizing themes of resilience, truth, and the ongoing struggle against misinformation. The statement read in part, "We have always been transparent about our experiences, and we will not be deterred by those who seek to rewrite history out of personal grievance." But behind the public messaging, the private reality was far more complicated. Meghan, according to multiple sources, struggled to regain her equilibrium. Friends described her as oscillating between anger and profound sadness, frustrated that someone who should have been an ally had become an antagonist. Harry, fiercely protective, reportedly made several attempts to reach out to Beatrice and Eugenie, hoping they might intervene with their mother. Both daughters, torn between loyalty to Sarah and sympathy for Harry, declined to get involved, recognizing that any intervention would only deepen the fractures. At Buckingham Palace, the communications team faced an impossible dilemma. Condemning Sarah would suggest the palace endorsed Meghan's narrative. Defending Sarah would imply validation of her accusations. And staying silent, the monarchy's default strategy, risked allowing the story to spiral further out of control. Ultimately, they chose silence, releasing only a brief, non-committal statement acknowledging that they were aware of the interview and had no further comment. William, monitoring the fallout from Kensington Palace, felt a complicated satisfaction. Sarah's revelation had done what the palace itself could never do, publicly question Meghan's narrative without institutional fingerprints. But he also understood the cost. Sarah had made herself radioactive, ensuring she would never return to the royal fold, and her willingness to speak openly set a precedent that could encourage others to break their silence. Princess Anne, ever pragmatic, saw the situation clearly. Sarah had burned her last bridge, and the family would need to ensure she had no remaining leverage, no additional information she might weaponize in future interviews. Quiet legal reviews were initiated, examining what Sarah might know, what she might say, and what protections the palace could invoke if she continued speaking. Camilla, reflecting on the situation privately, felt a deep sadness. Two women, both damaged by the same institution, had turned on each other rather than finding common ground. It was, she thought, the monarchy's cruelest legacy, not the scandals themselves, but the way they isolated people, turned them against one another, and ensured that survival often meant destroying someone else. By the end of the week, Sarah had given 2 additional interviews, one to an American podcast and another to a French magazine. In each, she elaborated on her earlier comments, adding details, offering examples, and making clear that her critique of Meghan was not a momentary outburst, but a considered perspective. The interviews were less inflammatory than the first, but their cumulative effect was significant. Sarah Ferguson had positioned herself as a truth-teller, and whether her truth was accurate or simply her version of events, it had fundamentally altered the conversation around Meghan and the Sussex departure. For Meghan, the damage was profound and lasting. Photographs from the following week showed her looking diminished, her usual radiant confidence replaced by a visible wariness. Friends reported that she had withdrawn from several planned public appearances, needing time to process not just Sarah's words, but their implications. Because Sarah's willingness to speak raised a terrifying question. If one exiled royal was willing to break silence, who might be next? The commercial implications also became apparent. While no major deals were immediately canceled, several projects Meghan had been developing experienced unexpected delays. Publishers who'd been interested in potential memoir expansions suddenly had scheduling conflicts. Brand partnerships that had seemed certain developed complications. The palace hadn't needed to actively damage Meghan's career. Sarah's intervention had created enough uncertainty that partners were reassessing risk calculations on their own. For Beatrice and Eugenie, the situation was heartbreaking. They loved their mother, understood her pain, recognized the injustices she'd endured. But they also felt sympathy for Meghan, another woman who'd been chewed up by the royal machinery. The fact that their mother had chosen to attack someone in a similar position, rather than finding solidarity, left both daughters struggling with complicated feelings of loyalty, disappointment, and helplessness. In Portugal, Sarah experienced her own complicated aftermath. The interviews had brought her attention certainly the kind of global coverage she hadn't received in years. Some outlets framed her as brave truth-teller, finally speaking uncomfortable realities about Meghan's calculated approach. Others painted her as bitter, jealous woman attacking someone more successful out of spite. Sarah told herself she didn't care about the criticism, that she'd spoken necessary truth. But alone in her villa, watching the Atlantic turn gray under December skies, she wondered if the momentary satisfaction of speaking had been worth the permanent consequences. Because the consequences were permanent. Any chance of reconciliation with the palace, already slim, was now impossible. Her daughters, while still loving her, had grown more distant, wary of being pulled into ongoing drama. And Meghan, who might have been a natural ally in the shared experience of royal exile, was now an enemy. Sarah had chosen her moment of truth, but the cost was complete isolation. She was more alone now than she'd ever been, and the attention she'd briefly commanded was already fading, leaving only the wreckage behind. As December continued and initial shock began to fade, one question dominated conversations among royal watchers, Sussex supporters, and palace insiders alike. Had Sarah spoken truth the family was too afraid to acknowledge? Or had she simply weaponized her bitterness against someone who represented everything she'd lost? The answer, like so much in this story, depended entirely on who was telling it. And the tragedy was that both women, Sarah and Meghan, were probably telling their own truths. They just happened to be truths that couldn't coexist without destroying the possibility of understanding between them. Closing reflection. As the first week of December drew to a close, the story of Sarah Ferguson's revelation and Meghan Markle's breakdown settled into the broader narrative of royal dysfunction, a narrative that seemed to grow darker and more complicated with each passing year. What this moment revealed more than anything was the particular cruelty of exile, not just physical distance from the institution, but the emotional and psychological isolation that comes from being cast out of a world that once defined you. Sarah Ferguson had lived that reality for decades, and her attack on Meghan was, in many ways, the desperate act of a woman who had nothing left to lose. But it also revealed something about Meghan, a vulnerability she had worked so hard to conceal. For years, Meghan had presented herself as unshakable, resilient, able to withstand any attack. But Sarah's words, coming from someone who understood the system intimately, pierced that armor in a way tabloid criticism never could, because tabloids could be dismissed as biased, sensationalist. But Sarah was an insider, and her critique carried a weight that Meghan couldn't simply deflect. For families everywhere, royal or otherwise, the lesson is painfully clear. Exile does not heal wounds. Distance does not resolve grievances. And when people are pushed to the margins, when they lose everything they once held dear, they become unpredictable, dangerous not from malice, but from desperation. The breakdown we witnessed was not a sign of weakness, but the human cost of living in a world where every word, every action, and every moment of vulnerability becomes a weapon in someone else's hand. Thank you for staying with this story. Sometimes the most painful revelations come not from enemies, but from those who should have understood us best.